We'll do a review in the Sichas in Chelek Tezvav in volume 15, the fourth Sicha for the Parshas Vayigash. It's a Rashi Sicha, in which the Rebbe explains what it means that the Yidden war in the land of Goshen, which is in the land of Mitzrayim. The Rebbe goes through later on, first in Pshat, but then in Pnimius or in Yonim, to explain that Goshen had a special connection with the Jewish people. They inherited, they lived there. It came from Sora as a gift from Paroi, and yet this all is still considered the Eretz Lo Lahem, a lotion of Gerus, as the Rebbe will explain in details in the Sicha, in the Pnimius Inyonim, and we'll go step by step. Aleph, Vayigash Dalet Aleph. So if the Verter Vayeocha Zubo, so this talks about after Yosef became the basically all in charge and fed everybody, and the family was reunited, and the Yidden lived there, and it says Vayeocha Zubo, that Vayeshev Yisrael Beretz Mitzrayim, they lived there and they Ocha Zubo. What exactly does Vayocha Zubo mean? They held on to it. In letzten Parsha, the Werte Vayocha Zubo, in letzten Posuk von unser Parsha, that's the last verse of the Parsha Vayigash. The Posuk says, Vayeshev Yisrael Beretz Mitzrayim. So Israel, the Jewish people, lived in the land of Egypt. Where in the land of Egypt? Beretz Goshen, in the land of Goshen. Then it says, Vayeocha Zubo, Vayifru Vayirbu Moed. And they held on to it. I'm citing it now, we'll see in a minute. And they were fruitful and they multiplied very much. That's the end of the verse. That took place in the land of Goshen, the land of Mitzrayim. What does Vayeocha Zubo mean? Seine Faran Zwei Pirushim. There's two interpretations. Either, as Rashi says, it comes that it's an inheritance. Vayeocha Zubo, they inherited, it became their nachala. Or the other extreme, just the opposite. Vayeocha Zubo, they were held onto it forcefully by the land against their will. Either Rashi, Aleph, that Pirush from Vayeocha Zu Loitum Pshat from Posik. The meaning of Vayeocha Zu, according to the simple meaning of the verse, Rashi says Loshen Achuza. It's an holding on. It belongs like a inheritance or held on. Belongs to them. Language of an Achuza. And number Beis, the second we have in the Medrash, the Pirush for Medrash. The Medrash says it's not that they inherited the land, but rather the land was holding on to them. The land was holding on to them. It would grab them. As a person who was forcefully held on, the land held on to them forcefully. This means, as Vayeocha Zu is from Loshen Achiza Halten. Loshen comes from the language of holding on to, either inheritance, Achuza, or held on, Oiches Halten. Now, Rashi learns it's not like the Medrash that it's against their will, because this is a introduction that they multiplied and they were fruitful. So the pasuk is trying to say something that they were comfortable, not to say it was against their will. So in Pshat, as Rebbe will explain, the hechrech in Pshat to der shlila from Pirush Loshen Achiza, the Rashi's the force, the proof, and what we're forced is simply to reject that Ocha Zubo means to held on to it. They were held on forcefully. Because from Hemshech HaPosik is from the flow, the continuation of the verse. It says, Vayeshev Goimer, And then the pasuk says they sat there. Vayeochazu bo. Then it says vayifru gomer, and they multiplied. So is mashma. So it seems, it appears, it's understood as midiverter vayeochazu bo. With the word Yochzubo, mean the Torah zu unterstreichen. The Torah means to emphasize dem Eufon von Seher basetzen sich in Eretz Goshen, the way they settled in the land of Goshen. As it is given azah, it was in such a way they settled. It brought about vayifru vayirbu. They settled in such a way. Azach was had gebracht. It was in a way that brought about to vayifru vayirbu me'od. They were fruitful and they increased very much. Ken men nit al derech hapshat lernen pirush hamedrash. So we are not able, in the path of simple meaning of the pasuk, to learn as the interpretation of the medrash. Azeir his yashrus is given in an oifon from Bal Korchoy, that they settled there sort of against their will. That doesn't lead up to being fruitful and multiplying there. Was führt nicht zu vayifru gomer. That does not lead to being fruitful. Man kann euch nicht teichen. Vaye. But there's another way Rashi wants to, the Rebbe wants to, maybe we should try holding on, but maybe we should say that they're holding on to the land, but we still teach the word ochaz from language of holding on, not of inheritance. So the Rebbe adds over here, "Meken euch nit teichen." We also cannot translate "Vayoy ochazu bo meloshon achiza." That comes from the language of holding on. As Eden haben ihr gehalten, they held her the land. The Eden were holding the land. It would still mean holding, but it means the Eden were holding her. Durch ihr basetzen, by settling it, they were holding on to it because the vowels do not fit. Weil dann hat gedarft stehen, it should say vayoichazu, that aleph mit acholam bo. Vayoichazu bo, they held on to here. Not vayeochazu, they were held on by. We need vayeochazu bo with the aleph under the aleph. Aleph mit akometz. As they seien durch ihr gehalten geworden. They were held by her. So that tells us, like the Medrash says, that they were held. But since we can't say that they were held by the land because that doesn't fit with Vayifru Vayirbu, so therefore we're saying Vayeochazu Meloshen Achuza, and a loshon that they inherited the land. Okay. So it turns out that these two Peshatim, these two interpretations, are opposite, totally contradictory. The Vayochazu bo in Pshat means that they inherited, it was a positive, and the Vayechazu bo in the Medrash is a negative. Two interpretations in the same world should have a connection between them, as the Rebbe said many times. Shefil Mor Geret, already spoken many times, as Oibse Seinen do Merere Pirushim from Razal. If there is more, several commentaries of our sages of blessed memory, of demselben Wort, on the same word, or the inyan or subject, meint es nit as they seinen in ganzen mechulek zwischen sich. It does not mean that they are totally disagreement amongst themselves. Nor adarabe, on the contrary. The Baal ze seinen Pirushin im selben Wort, since they are interpretation of the same word, they're both interpreting the same word. When we have several interpretations, Musmen Zogen, we must say, as a haben zwischen sich a gewisse Sheiches, they have a certain connection amongst themselves. So what are we going to do about these two Pirushim by us? Aber die zwei eben der Monte Pirushim, but the two above mentioned interpretations, seinen Lichheire, they appear need blois Nicht shaykh zwischen sich. Not only are they not connected amongst themselves, no noch mehr, but more than that, hyperdik, they are opposite in Teuchen, einer von zweiten. The idea of these two commentaries are just opposite one from another. Leut and Pshat von Posik, according to this simple meaning of the verse, seinen die Wörter Vayeochazubo Madgish. The words Vayeochazubo, they emphasize as the Hisyashvus from Bnei Yisrael in Eretz Goshen, that the settling of the Bnei Yisrael in the land of Goshen is given in an Eufun. It was in a way, was is geworden Zeir land. It became their land. Vayochazubo. It became theirs. Zeirer anachuza. It's their holding on. It's theirs. It belongs to them. It's like their inheritance. Unleuten pirush hamedrash, but according to the translation, interpretation of the medrash komtois, it turns out as the hadgosh is no verkehrta. The emphasis is the opposite. The Bnei Yisrael seine Neches geworden von Eretz Mitzrayim Bal Korchom. They were being held by the land of Egypt against their will. Base. So the Rebbe first explains the first Rashi in this pasuk. In the pasuk of Vayeshev, Yisrael Beretz Mitzrayim, the Rashi seems to be difficult, and the Rebbe is going to explain the Rashi. But when es werden move noch when weiter sein, we'll understand this after explaining the Friedrichen Dibur from Pirush Rashi, the previous commentary of Rashi, of Hascholus HaKosuv on the beginning of the verse. Which is the introduction to Vaye Ochazubo, that they inherited in it in the land of Goshen. Rashi places himself on the words of the pasuk. It says, "Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim." Yisrael, the Yidden, settled in the land of Egypt. So Rashi quotes Vayeshev Yisrael be'Mitzrayim, unis befarish, and he explains vehechon, and we're in Eretz Mitzrayim, be'eretz Goshen, in the land of Goshen. The pasuk said v'yeshno beretz Mitzrayim beretz Goshen. Rashi adds, and it says we're in Eretz Mitzrayim beretz Goshen. Shehi meretz Mitzrayim, that is from the land of Egypt. Beforshim zogen. So what is Rashi telling us here? As Rashi kum davon and the shaila, what Rashi is coming to answer the question that will arise from Loshen be'eretz Mitzrayim beretz Goshen, the language in the pasuk in the land of Mitzrayim, in the land of Goshen, is mashma. It would appear as a zaynet zwei besondere arotzes, that these are two separate lands. The Riber zogt Rashi, so Rashi therefore says, "Vehechon beretz Goshen," and we're in Mitzrayim, in the land of Goshen. Si is ki ilu in pasuk state. It's as if in the pasuk, instead of just saying beretz Mitzrayim beretz Goshen, as if it's written beretz Mitzrayim, in the land of Egypt, vehechon, and we're in beretz Goshen, land of Goshen. Rashi is sort of inserting the extra word. But in that case, the Rebbe said, if that's all what Rashi is coming to tell us, so is over nit moving. It's not understood. First of all, okay, you want to add the word vehechon. Why does Rashi have to add she meretz Mitzrayim? We know that. Aleph, farvos daf Rashi meisiv zayin. After Rashi says vehechon, Meretz Goshen. Why did Rashi have to say she Meretz Mitzrayim, that Goshen is from the land of Egypt? Das versteht nur doch von dem Hemshech. That's understood from the continuation. Meretz Mitzrayim vehechon, Meretz Goshen. That is where, so that is Meretz Mitzrayim. Meretz Mitzrayim vehechon, Meretz Goshen. In Meretz Goshen, so we know we don't have to add now Sheretz Mitzrayim. And actually, the same question is in the pasuk. Why does the pasuk have to say Beretz Mitzrayim and then say Goshen? It could have just said Goshen. Similar, you can ask to this on the pasuk itself. So was darf der Posuk sagen be'eretz Mitzrayim? Why does it have to say in the land of Egypt? Und then you have to interpret it that it is Beretz Goshen, as is genug Beretz Goshen. Just say Beretz Goshen. Me weiß schon, as das is in Eretz Mitzrayim. We know that it's in Eretz Mitzrayim. The Balder state free in the Parsha. It already says in the portion. Befedish, as Eretz Goshen is a till from Eretz Mitzrayim. That Eretz Goshen is a part of the land of Egypt, as we learned easier in the Psukim over there, that where he settled them was in the land of Mitzrayim, in the land of Goshen. And further, number 3, Rashi is only trying to explain, as the Meforshim explain. Why does the pasuk say Beretz Mitzrayim, Beretz Goshen, or that it means Heichon Beretz Goshen? Pavosis are mighty. That's all Rashi is coming to tell us. Pavosis are mighty from pasuk Oich the Verter Vayeshiv Yisrael. So how come he also quotes from the verse the words Vayeshiv Yisrael? He's not interpreting. He's only interpreting the meaning of Beretz Mitzrayim and Beretz Goshen. So the Rebbe will explain, because the issue that we have over here sitting in Eretz Goshen seems to be that the Yidden settled over there, and that would not be considered, as the pasuk told earlier to Avram, that they will be a stranger. Be'eretz lo lahem. Seemed like they settled down in Mitzrayim very well. The Rebbe explains, it says, it was still Beretz Mitzrayim, and even though they were Beretz Goshen, Shehi Meretz Mitzrayim, Shehi Meretz Mitzrayim, that is, it's still Mitzrayim, it's Leilahem. And let's see what the Rebbe explains. Gimel. That Biyud in them, the explanation in this, Rashi is the Oisun Subavoranen. Rashi is intended here to answer the stira von Teuchen HaPosuk on the theme, the idea of this verse, von Afriye Dike Parsha, from something which we learned earlier. Beim Bris Bein HaPesorim, by the covenant amongst the pieces, how the Eibishter gesagt zu Avram, and Hashem told to Avram, Ki ger yeh zaracho be'eretz lo ilahem goimer, that your seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. And then they will go out. Thus haste. That means, as Eider the Bnei Yisrael will gain ken Eretz Yisrael, that prior to the Bnei Yisrael going to the land of Eretz Yisrael, to Israel, they first will need to go through and suffer through the exile, by being a stranger, in a strange land, a land that is not theirs. So Rashi has a problem. This is what says previous the pasuk. How could we possibly say, as Bnei Yisrael, seinen dem Golus abgekommen, they suffered this exile, mit zeir gefinnen sich in Mitzrayim, by going into Egypt, by finding themselves in Egypt. Beis mirzen do in pasuk, as we see at the time we see in this verse, as they haben sich dort besetzt, that they settled there. Vayeshev from Loshen Toishev. Vayeshev settling comes from the Loshen of a settled, Heipach from Ger, which would be the opposite of a stranger. They settled there. Under Tzunoch. And where did they settle? We know in Eretz Goshen. They were in land of Goshen. Was is given via state freedom posik. That was, as the posik says earlier, Meitav Haaretz. That was the best of the land. Uninan Oifen. And how did they settle there? So they were settled. They were in Mitzrayim. They were in Eretz Goshen, which was the best of the land. Uninan Oifen with the posik is Domisayim. And how? In what way did they settle? From Vayigash, they inherited. They were lived there. It became their inheritance. So the question is, how is this fit to be loy lahem? Und darüber is Rashi meitig euch the Wörter Vayeshev Yisrael. That's why Rashi is also quoting from the verse, Israel settled there. Weil die Schwierigkeit in Posik is, wie gesagt, because the difficulty in this Posik is, in the Eifum von Yisrael's Vayeshev in Eretz Goshen, in the way that the Yidden settled in Eretz Goshen. Vayeshev is Rashi's problem. Why did they settle it? If it would say Vayogar, it wouldn't be a problem, but it says Vayeshev. Die Kashe Bavorim der Posik, this question is answered by the Posik, was is Mavur in Pirush Rashi, which is articulated, as Rashi articulates, explains what the Posik is hearing. Durch Meisu sein die Wörter, by the Posik adding the words Be'eretz Mitzrayim, and Rashi writes Shehi Me'eretz Mitzrayim. That is Eretz Mitzrayim. Soif, because at the end of the day, is Oich Eretz Goshen Achelik von Eretz Mitzrayim. The land of Goshen, still, notwithstanding all of the being settled there, it's still part of the land of Mitzrayim, and therefore, Unit Eretz Canaan. It is not the land of Canaan. Und der Fahr wird sehr besetzen sich in Eretz Goshen. And that's why when they settled in the land of Goshen, Farechant als Golus, it's considered as exile. Weil mit dem Gufos, wo sie gefinnen sich nicht in Eretz Canaan. Because the fact alone that they're not in the land of Canaan, maybe they're Yochzubo, maybe Vayesha, but they're still not in Canaan, Zeyer Eretz, which is their land, Zayne Zeagoy, Goymer Be'eretz Loy Lahem. They are a stranger. They're not in their land. Notwithstanding that if within Eretz Goshen they settled, but it's still Loy Lahem, and that's why the Pasuk and Rashi say Eretz Mitzrayim, Shem Eretz Mitzrayim, to emphasize this idea. However, this explanation explains on the simple meaning why they were still Loy Lahem, but in the end of the day, in the inner matter of things, the Rebbe continues the Sicha to explain, but on the practical side of it, in the inner, they did settle in the land of Goshen. Let it be Tztaka Loy Lahem. Let's look inside. Dalet. As is aber noch als nit glatik, it's still not smooth. Akolponim b'pnimiyus inyonim, at least the way it's in the inner things. See, is Yodua. It is known as the Kavone from Golus Mitzrayim is given that the intent of the exile of Egypt was as Eden Zolun dort ausgeleitet werden in sein Roi zu Kabbalas HaTorah. That why did they go to Golus Mitzrayim? It was in order for them to be refined, to purified, so that they should be fit to receiving the Torah. Und hereinkommen der noch in Eretz Yisrael, and then they can enter Eretz Yisrael. Heint, wie hat sich fort ausgeführt? So, question is how? Therefore, how did it accomplish Odi Kavone? How did this intend the Leiterungen, the refinement from Golus, und Shibud Mitzrayim, and the slavery of Egypt, durch dem Inyan from Vayeshev Yisrael, through Yidden sitting in Goshen. And the Kasha wird noch stärker. The question becomes even stronger. Leut wie der Inyan von Vaye Ochazubo wird mevuer in Chelek Adrash Shebetoira. How the Vaye Ochazubo is explained in the section of the Drash of the Torah, which we will see that it was a pretty settled way, and to a certain extent that actually Eretz Yisrael, like Eretz Goshen, belonged to the Jewish people. Some say, even according to the Radak, that eventually they inherited it. So it all seems like Goshen was a pretty good place for them. The Rebbe explains that we also have Golus in the Sikha, as in the Hemshech, in a ruchnistic way, in a more spiritual way, and the refinement comes in Torah discussing, as we'll see. But right now, the Rebbe's question is, how could Eretz Goshen serve as the place in which they were refined because of the suffering? It doesn't seem like it was suffering. And besides the point the Rebbe brings down, Eretz Goshen had a very specific relationship. Von dem, was steht in Posuk bei Ochazu Bo, Loshen Achuza, it says that they inherited. It's like, seems like it was an inheritance for them. Darf ois kommen, then it should be, as Eretz Goshen is given, that it was, b'meile geblieben, that should remain, an Achuza v'Yerusha ba'id, it should be a inheritance. It should be something that belongs, held on by the Yidden. Was Lechoiris doesn't ganzen nicht move, that's totally not understood. How could we possibly say about a section of the land of Egypt that this is holding on and this is an inheritance? Libnei Yisrael, for the Bnei Yisrael. Eretz Canaan is a Yerusha Farid. The land of Canaan is an inheritance. The Pasuk says, "Losses lechoes oretz hazois l'rishta," to give to you. The Pasuk says to Avram to give him for an inheritance. But not the land of Egypt. So how does it say Vayeochazuba? This is not a question the Rebbe says now in Pshat, because the fact that they lived there for 212 years, that could be called Achuza, temporary. But in the Primis Inyonim, why would he call that an Achuza? In Derech HaPshat is a stake ken kash in it. In the style that we learn in Pshat is not actually a question. Since this settling of the land of Goshen, that stretched the ganze Zeit von Golus Mitzrayim, the entire time of the exile of Mitzrayim, Redu Shono, that was for 210 years, as the number, as it says, Redu, Kiminyan Redu, 210 years, is Masim in Pashto. So in the simple, it's fitting of them, the Losh Nachuza, to be held on because they lived there for a long period. But in the style of the expounding of Torah of Drush, was his matgish them Drush und Pnimi. That emphasizes the Drush, the expounding, and the inner meaning is fortnit gatik, is not understood. And the Rebbe quotes that now from the Radak, he said that he didn't actually inherited it. The Radak in Sefer Yeshua, the Radak in the book of Yeshua, Breng B'Shem Hadrash, quotes in the name of the Drash, Ados was a state dort, what it says there as Yeshua angenommen, that he conquered Yeshua as Kol Eretz HaGoshen, the entire land of Goshen. Main Testake, this actually refers to Goshen Shel Eretz Mitzrayim, that's the Goshen of the land of Egypt. V'nivlaz b'toich Ore Yisrael, that has been swallowed in, it's absorbed in the lands of Israel. Und der Fahr rechnet es, der Posik dort, and that's why the Posik details it over there, zwischen the Stadt von Achlas Bnei Yehuda, from the inheritance of Bnei Yehuda. So it means that they were taking inheritance. So like them, now that we know that they didn't actually inherited it, so it's taking inheritance. Like them, according to this, so according to the style of the Rash, you can't behind them lotion by Yehochazubah. We could explain why it says they held on, became inheritance, because it actually became inheritance. As those was Eretz Goshen is given a Yerusha by Eden, that why did the Eretz Goshen become an inheritance by Eden? Is those the farvos is nivla geworden, because that was been absorbed, swallowed in, betoich Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Eden, in Zman from Yeshua, in the time of Yeshua. So it's not by Yehochazubah then, or give that inheritance then, but later on it happened. But why would the pasuk say now by Yehochazubah for something that's going to happen so many years later? So it's difficult to interpret it this way too. Because how does it really fit to say, as in the Zeit from the pasuk by Yeshiv Yisrael v'goymer, that in the time when the pasuk says by Yeshiv Yisrael, Zol Shein Od Di His Yashvus in Eretz Goshen. So the settling then in the land of Goshen, Ongerufen mitten werden mit Nomen Achuza. Why would we call that Achuza? Holding on to a Yerusha, they're far because was mit 100 Jahren später, with hundreds of years later on. But Eretz Goshen Nivla werden, the land of Goshen is going to be absorbed through Chibush Yeshua. When Yeshua conquers it, Svishin Dora Yisrael amongst the land of Yidden. So we're not talking about what happened then, but we're talking about what happens hundreds of years later. That's really is not fitting. And it's mashma that they inherited then. How could we say about the land of Goshen that they inherited then? But the Rebbe says, because Eretz Goshen, according to the Medrash, was actually given to Sarah by Pare when he took her into the palace. And then when he let her go, he gave her a gift, the lands of Goshen. So therefore, it turns out that it was an inheritance. But in that case, if that was an inheritance, so how do we call this Eretz Leilahem? It's a inheritance. They belong because of Sarah. And there's an explanation that this is actually the suffering in Torah and mitzvahs before we talk about the Leilahem, as the Rebbe will explain. Okay, so the Rebbe says that this is the beer in them. The explanation. Why is it called Achuza? As state in Medrash, it says in the Medrash, as Paroi hat Soren gegeben Eretz Goshen Achuza, that Paroi gave to Sora the land of Goshen as an inheritance. Ulefikoch Yoshvi Yisrael Beretz Goshen Shel Sora Imenu, and that's why the Yidden said in the land of Goshen, because that belonged to our mother Sora. Kum dachois, it turns out, as Idnom Bakum and Eretz Goshen be Yerusha from Sora. So it comes out they did get it as an inheritance from Sora, and that's why. But that makes the question even stronger. But with this explanation, the question is even greater. How did the Bnei Yisrael suffer the exile of Egypt by finding themselves in the land of Goshen? But Goshen belonged to them als Yerusha, as inheritance from Sarah. And therefore, automatically, they weren't Gomer Ba'oretz Leilahem, a stranger in a land that's not there. They are in their land. And the Rebbe explains in Ois Hey that in the Torah, the Alter Rebbe says that all these physical problems that you had in the slavery in the land of Mitzrayim can also be interpreted on a spiritual level, that in the level of Torah. There's different ways and the different challenges we have in the land of Torah, the way of Torah. And it turns out that for a certain period of time, the Yidden had their challenges, Loilahem, and the suffering of the Golus in a more spiritual way. Let's see. Hey, but when es verstehen, we'll understand it like them, as is mevuid in Torah, according to what's explained in the Torah, as the alle prote avoida from Golus Mitzrayim, all the details of this work of the exile of Egypt that the pasuk articulates. The pasuk says ba'avoida kosher. First we have ba'avoida, that's the work generally. Then it's kosher, difficult. B'choimer, with mortar, ubilveinim, and with bricks, goimer. So it says there's einem faran oichin ruchnis dicken zin. They also exists in the spiritual sense, not the physical, but in the spiritual sense. In Eisek HaTorah, when one learns Torah, there states in Zohar, as brought down in the Zohar, that ba'avoid, as it states in the Zohar, ba'avoido kosher, work hard labor, zukushya, that represents questions that in Torah learning, the challenges, the questioning, questions. B'choimer, umar do kal v'choimer. This is the kal v'choimer. The foratory, that's hinted in the choimer. Ubilveinim, do libun hilchas, that is the whitening of the halacha, lavan, libun hilchas. And the Alter Rebbe explained, Und Horvet in der Avodah Kosher von Torah, when a Yid does and puts an effort in the difficult, laborious work of Torah, kommt up damit, that how he already accomplishes, it suffices that the Avodah Kosher from Golus Mitzrayim, that he does not, that's sufficient, and he does not have to experience the actual hard labor of exile of Egypt. And he needs not do that physically. His spiritual effort and spiritual difficult challenges in Torah makes up so that he doesn't have to suffer further in physically. As the Mishnah, the Rebbe brings down the brackets, with the Mishnah Zokt, as the Mishnah says, Kol ha-mekabel olav oil Torah. Anyone who accepts upon themselves the yoke of Torah, it doesn't say kabel of Torah, specifically the yoke of Torah, because the diik in them is the emphasis and the specific language is oil Torah. He accepts the yoke of Torah. It is evzich mekabel dem yoch. He accepts upon himself that yoke. The avodah kosher chul hanal b'zoyer, that hard work, as mentioned earlier in the Zohar, from Torah, is mavirim mimenu el malchus v'oil derech eretz. So you remove from him the yoke of the government and the yoke of work. Meaning, you can substitute the hard by working hard in Torah to take away the hard work that the government and the regular lifestyle requires. You fulfill it by the fact that you worked hard in Torah. Similar to that, we can explain in our case as well. Also while they were in the land of Goshen. Seinen the Bnei Yisrael abgekommen, the Bnei Yisrael have made up. They accomplished in the matters from them Golus v'Shibud Mitzrayim. In the exile and the slavery of Egypt, they made up for that Golus Mitzeir Yigias HaTorah with their effort in Torah. In the Beis HaTalmud, so they had a academy, a home in which they studied. Was Yaakov and Bonov of Vayigash that Yaakov and Bonov set up. So that is what they fulfilled, that suffering. And thus is the burden, the hardship. And thus is euch the remes, and this is also the hint al derech yenish shel Torah, in the style of the wine of Torah, the inner meaning, not the pshat of the Rashi, the beer from Pirush Rashi vayeyochas zubo, that they held on to it lashon achuzah and wem chuzah. Der Golus Mitzrayim in sein erster Tekufa, the exile of Egypt in its first period, when the Eden haben sich dort besetzt, when the Jews settled there, by Yeshiv Yisrael, is nicht gewen verbunden mit Avodah Kosher v'chulu begashmis. That wasn't associated, wasn't tied to hard work physically. Adarabah, on the contrary, the multi says gewen in an oifen. At that time, it was in a situation that you can sense that this is made of Haaretz. You can feel this is the best of the land. You didn't feel any difficulties physically. The contrary, it was a beautiful land. And as if they're there in their inheritance. Alam gewusst und anerkannt, everybody knew and recognized that the Jews find themselves in their own land. That they conduct themselves as they wish to. Nicht seinig untergeworfen dem Shibud Mitzrayim, not being under the dominance of the slavery of Egypt. Und der Shibud HaGolus, and how did that slavery of exile express itself? Hat sich ausgedrückt, that expressed itself. Blois in der Avodah Kosher from Torah. Only in the hard work of Torah. That's how was the expression of the shibud. But in the physical sense, that did not affect them at the time, and that's why it's Vayeshev, and that's why it was really a time in which they didn't have any. So while the Rebbe explained that the fact that the Yidden labored in the Beis HaTalmud and they substituted for the Avodah Kosher physically, but how could we still call, the Rebbe asks, the land of Goshen Leilahem when it's an inheritance from Sarah? Vav. As further, it still requires explanation. V'bal soif soif. In the end of Eden, Giyarshin Leuten Pirush HaMedrash. The Jews inherited, as the Medrash explained, Eretz Goshen from Sarah. They got it from Sarah by Yachazuba inheritance. Heint Vikenes fortfarechen werden als Golus. How could we still consider it to be exiled? But it's Loilahem, not their land. It is their land. Is the beer in them? The explanation is it's take not the same as Eretz Yisrael. It's still Loilahem. They inherited it, but it's not the same. It's not their land that they really have, which is the land of Eretz Yisrael. Is the beer in them? Choch Eretz Goshen not gehert to Eden, even though land of Goshen belonged to the Eden mitzad the Yerusha from Sodom because of the inheritance of Sodom. Doch hat sie nicht vermogt in sich the dark des Hakdusha. Still, it did not own. It did not have in itself Goshen, the darkest Hakadusha, the level, the step of holiness was Eretz Yisrael hat in sich. Eretz Yisrael, the land of the Eden, has in it. Eretz Asher Goimer Ein Hashem Elkecha Bo V'Goimer. The Pasuk says a land that God's eyes are there all the time. That's not Eretz Goshen. Und in them is Bashtanen der Golus Be'eretz Leilahem. That consisted in what exiled, not in their land. Be'ez Zeir is Yashvus in Eretz Goshen. Also, while they were settled in the land of Goshen, it would still Oich in the Erster Tekufa, also during the first period in which they did settle there and they had the Torah before it was the hardship, the work. Also, then it was still considered, it is still Eretz Leilahem, it's not their land. Eden haben sich mit Steir given. The Jews were in pain, was they gefinnen sich in an Ort, that they are not in a place was is nit kein Eretz Asher Goimer Ein Hashem Elkecha Bo Goimer. It's not Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't have the qualities. It doesn't have that special relationship that a land with God's eyes are there the whole time. Und der Mitgufe is the Eretz Leilahem. That itself is what makes it not their land. Nit the Chashivus und Kedusha was is Roi Lahem. Not the importance, not the holiness which is fitting to them. With them tsar gufa, and that pain itself that they didn't have what they deserve, seien sie abgekommen a Teil von dem Shibut und Meitzer von Golus Mitzrayim. That's how they actually fulfilled, and the suffering that they took, that made up part of the enslavement and part of the squeezed of the Golus Mitzrayim, even while they were in Goshen, by not being in Eretz Yisrael. And yet, the Rebbe explains in this Zion that later on it got even Begashmi is difficult. Zion, aber Agam, as that only from Zeir Golus in Mitzrayim, even though the way they started the exile in Egypt is given in an oifen, it wasn't away from Vayoy Chazu Bokinal that they inherited as above. Is ober dos alein shen given a yirida. That in its own was already a descent legabe zeir matzev u'madrega, relative to their situation and their step. Be'ez ze zayin given in Eretz Canaan, when they were relative, the way they were in Eretz Canaan. Und das hat gegeben an Ort. And this actually gave allowance, space, as on später darfen durchgehen, dem Golus Yeshivit Mitzrayim Kipshute, that later on they need to actually go through the exile and the slavery in Mitzrayim, literally, in which they were enslaved by the Egyptians. So they started with that form of slavery, with that form of descent, of not being in Eretz Yisrael, and not being, I mean, that is Canaan, and missing out on that level, and that caused them their slavery. Later on, they came to the full slavery, this haste. As noch dem Siyum von Od der erste Tekufa, after the conclusion of this first period, in dem Zman when Vayomus Yosef v'cholecha v'chol aderahu, the time that Yosef and all his brother, the whole generation, they died. Was sulidem hat angeheben Fällen the Yigia b'Torah, that started to be missing the effort in Torah in Beis Talmud Shel Yaakov Abanov. That study hall, Yaakov Abanov, there were no more these learners over there. Und es hat sich angegeben, vergessen der Zar von dem Sein Beretz Leilahem. And they started to forget that pain of not being in their land because the people that were learning Torah and began to be missing. Hat sich dann angefangen, so then it started the Shibud Mitzrayim, the slavery of Egypt, that literally being in the slavery. By Yamas Ayis and Chol Aderahu, when the Pasuk says started the whole goes. Kipshute. Business hat sich ausgesehen till it appeared Ki'ilu Oysa Yom Nichsel Mitzrayim, as if in that day they entered Egypt. That's when Yosef dies. It appears as if they did, even though they were there from before. Before there was a different level of Mitzrayim. It was the Mitzrayim of Torah, the Shibud of Torah. Now, when Yosef dies, and now it's as if they came then to Mitzrayim. But genommen vergessen, hat das Land gehört zu Eden. They took to forgetting. They started forgetting. But this is a land that belongs to Eden. Hat angegeben, feeling the Bitterkeit from Meitzon and Golos, and we started feeling the bitterness of the oppression, the being pressed and being in exile, when there is lacking the level of Torah. Das is Rashi Oysen Somatic Sein Bepirusha. And this is what Rashi is telling us and emphasizing to us in his commentary. Vayeshev Yisrael beretz Mitzrayim. Vehechon, we're beretz Goshen shehi meretz in Mitzrayim. We're in the land of Goshen, which is beretz Mitzrayim. In Onheb, in the beginning, is the Golus Mitzrayim Take given. Vehechon in Anoif von Eretz Goshen. In the beginning, it was where it was in Eretz Goshen. It started off with Eretz Goshen. Meitav Oretz, the best of the land. But on the other hand, it's still from the land of Egypt. Those Gufa was Idnom sich gedarf versetzen in Eretz Goshen. The fact that they had to settle in the land of Goshen, meint schon a Yerid in Eretz Mitzrayim. That already means a descent in the land of Egypt. Und noch mehr. Eretz Goshen allein is verwandelt geworden in einem ärgsten Golus Mitzrayim. The land of Goshen itself turned into the worst exile Mitzrayim, Shehi Me'eretz Mitzrayim. It is from the land of Egypt. B'shas mehot nit oizgenitz the meitav ha'oretz von Eretz Goshen Avedis Hashem. When they did not utilize the best of the land of Eretz Goshen in the service to Hashem, B'adrabe, on the contrary, they're Vayishman, they're becoming fat, quoting the Pasuk Vayishma Yisrael, Vayivot, this becoming the meitav ha'oretz, giving him, becoming fat, brought to Vayivot, to kicking, is in Eretz Goshen Gufa. So then in the land Goshen of itself, where the Eden hom gelebt b'chol meshach zman ha'golus kiral, where the Eden lived throughout the Golus, geworden der Shibut Mitzrayim kipshutei, the slavery of Egypt came down literally in the Eretz Goshen. Yes, der Oben der Monter in Sif Dalet, Pirush from Vayochazu, Loshen Achuze, that they inherited, as Idnom Giyashin there is Goshen, that they inherited the land of Goshen is Euch Masi mit an Oiftu from Golus Mitzrayim B'Pnimis Yonim, also fitting with the exile of Egypt in the interminer of things, because the Yidden were there to inherit the sparks and everything else, what it came down to. So this is an inheritance. And from them is Euch verstandig. And from that, from the inner meaning, we also understand as Chotz, Leuten derech Pshat, even though in the style of the Pshat, muss nicht der Loschen Achuza and halten dem Teuchen von Yerusha. Achuza does not necessarily need to contain the meaning that it was an inheritance in the sense inheriting it is just holding on. As inom giyarshin that is Goshen, that they inherited the land of Goshen, like we said from Sorov, it doesn't need to say so in the Pshat. Is Rashi meramis, but Rashi hints with the Verte Loshon Achuza when he says that it is a language of Achuza from Teuchen from Yerusha, on the idea of Yerusha. This is Achuza is really an inheritance in Yenushal Torah, in the wine of Torah, that Rashi's language of Achuza fits with the idea of an inheritance of Yerusha. This is for Behalten in Pirush Rashi, the wine of Torah which is hidden in Rashi. The beer in them. What's the explanation? According to the inner meaning, the whole Aveda of Mitzrayim is to inherit the sparks of Kedusha. The Kavanah from Golus Mitzrayim, the intent of the exile of Egypt, is given was as Eden soll mevarer sein, for the Yidden to sort out to meet them mit sich and to take along with them the Nitzutzes HaKedusha. Those holy sparks, the holy sparks was gefunden sich in Mitzrayim, which find themselves in Egypt. Und das ist der Teuchen Pnimi von Vayinatzulos Mitzrayim. This is the inner meaning that they were cleaned out the Egyptian. They natzlu, they took advantage, and they saved from the Egyptians. They took out from them was the Chazal Zogn, the sparks that the Yidden took out from Mitzrayim. Sages of blessed memory say, Taichin asuha kimitsudo she'ein bo dogon hulu kimitsudo she'ein bo dogim. They made it like a net that there's no dogon, there's nothing there, emptied out totally, or like mitsula she'ein bo dogim, without fish, meaning it's all gone. As the Eden haben mevarer und meile given, that the Eden sorted out and they elevated the Nitzutza Kedusha from Olam HaToyu, these parts of Kedusha from the world of Toyu, was gefunden in Eretz Mitzrayim, which were found in Eretz Mitzrayim. The Eden cleaned them out totally, not Sloas Mitzrayim. Und das ist Rashi Meramis mit Vayigash Zubo. Rashi hints this Loshen Achuza, meaning of Achuza, holding on and an inheritance. The Kavona und Tachlis from Vayeshev Yisrael Beretz Mitzrayim. The intent and the goal of the Yidden settling in Eretz Mitzrayim, Golus Mitzrayim, the exile of Mitzrayim, is given was as Yidden's own dorten, that Jews should over there, durch them, by settling there, Yoirish sein, die Nitzutzis von Eures de Toyu. They should inherit the sparks of the light of Toyu. As the saying, as the known saying of my father-in-law, the Rebbe, Asidra Yerusha ba'umas ha'olam, that the way the inheritance goes by the nations of the world is al derech diksiv. It's similar to what it's written, ubein ein loy, that if there is no child, I mean, there's nobody to inherit, so we give the inheritance to his brother. Meaning, when there's no son to Esav, to Yaakov's brother, so we give it to the Achav, we give it to the Yid. There's no inheritance basically for the Kalim the Toyu, it is the Toyu. So who gets it? The Yid, the Yaakov gets it. Since Esav is Yaakov's brother, so in Eden, Yoidish, the Eirish, the Toyu, the Yidden are the ones that inherits the lights of Toyu, and they get all the sparks, and that's why it's called an inheritance, Achuza. And now we understand the question that we asked in the beginning of the two taichin of Vayechazu Bo, either a inheritance or held on to them. Apikol anal tes. Basically, is moving the kesher zwischen the zwei pirushim, the tie, the connection between the two interpretation in Vayei Ochazubo, what it means. Loitun pshat hakosuv, according to the simple meaning of the pasuk, is Vayei Ochazu from Loshun Achuza. Vayei Ochazu comes from the language of inheritance, because simply as the matters are externally, so at the time of the Parshas Vayigash, nicht angeheben der Shibut von Golus Mitzrayim. It did not yet begin the slavery. At that time, they settled it. They inherited it from Golus Mitzrayim. And the simple Demut hat sich noch angesehen. At that time, you realize, you can see, as Eretz Goshen is a Achuze by the Bnei Yisrael Canal, that the land of Goshen is an inheritance by the Bnei Yisrael. I said before. Aber Leute Medrash, but according to the Medrash, was teich is the Drash Pnimius from Yeder Inyan, which interprets the Drash and the inner of every matter, is Vayei Ochazu from Loshen Achiza. Vayei Ochazu is the language held on already as Oretz Hoysoy Chesed B'hem. The land already at that time was holding on to them, and it grabbed them. Shabal Korchoy Ochas Ochus Ba, the lost to Loshen. They were against their will, they're holding on there. The Bald as in Toich, since in the inner idea is the Yashus in Eretz Goshen. Settling in the land of Goshen, given that was a descent to Egypt, She Eretz Mitzrayim, because it is, as Rashi says, She Eretz Mitzrayim, Unochmer. And furthermore, that allowed eventually, on the Sinas Mokim, to Shibut Mitzrayim Kipshuta. It allowed for later on to be the literal slavery of Egypt. In Mesgalil, as the Rebbe said earlier, that after the first Yerida to the spiritual level came the physical, to the physical enslavement. So therefore, the descent to the land of Goshen given behelam ubipnimius, in a hidden and in an inner way, in an oifum from Eretz Hoysa Chezebem. Also, then the land was holding them. Apiderecha Medrash, even at that time, was holding them. The Tefeses Oisam, it was grabbing them. Shabbat Korcha Ochazba, they were Ochazba, they were grabbing hold of them. Und die Pnimis diker Kavone und Tam. And what is the inner reason? Why does the Golus have to hold on to them? Why does it have to be this idea from Vayei Ochazubo that hold on to them, like to Pirish from Medrash as that they always grab them? Why is that? Because that is the Kakavona is Merumas Yenishal Torah. It's hinted in the Yenishal Torah, what's in Pirish Rashi. They're Mekuvan from Zeir Muzun Zain Begolus Mitzrayim. What is the intent of their need to be in the exile of Mitzrayim, Kipirush HaMedrash, that it holds on, is ongedaited in Loshen Achuza. That is pointed out in the nine Achuza, because they need to inherit. For them to inherit all the good which finds itself in the sparks of Toyu. So in order for them to inherit that, Shenofelu B'Shvira, that fell in the fall, in the breakage of the vessels of Toyu in Mitzrayim, they fell into Egypt. So Egypt has to hold on to them so that they can inherit it. So then later on, they can go out with the great fortune. Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Vayigash Tovshin Chafei.